Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. This is Bel Lepe. I'm the CEO at Cerby. Francis Odum is our guest speaker and star speaker. Excited to have you here, Francis, and thank you so much for taking the time. Francis, of course, is over at Software Analyst Cyber Research as the Chief Cybersecurity Analyst, and excited to have been collaborating with him. And we're going to be going through the 2025 IGA Playbook focused on automating workflows and closing the coverage gap. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Francis here in a moment. But what I did want to mention as we're going through this presentation, if you all have any questions, please feel free to write them in to the chat or to the Q&A. We'll make sure to field them either throughout the presentation or towards the end. So questions are absolutely welcome. Thank you so much. But with that, Francis, I hand it over to you. Excited to get going.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bel, for having me. Thank you so much to the team at Cerby for hosting this platform. And thank you all. So really excited to do this presentation and really just to speak about the role of identity governance, identity governance and access controls. Many of you, I'm imagine a lot of our participants, whether you're a practitioner already, whether you've been in the industry for a while, we're all very familiar with this ecosystem of identity governance. And so we did a report earlier this year with the Software Analyst Cyber Research, where we identified and spoke to different identity leaders, as well as we did a lot of our research in which we wanted to share some of the key findings of what we're seeing happen as of 2025 as it relates to identity governance. And so a big part of that is how do we automate a lot of workflows and how do we close a lot of the coverage gaps that still exist today within IGA. So I'll go to maybe kick off our conversation is to first of all just take a high level look at the identity governance ecosystem as we know it today. I would say in general, the IGA market, it still remains one of the largest markets within cybersecurity, and then obviously within identity. We know huge amounts of money, huge budget goes into a lot of identity governance projects. And I think one thing we do know is IGA is at an inflection point. If anything, when we did this report, that was a key finding for us, in which we found out that IGA now is actually evolving from just the back office compliance checkbox, to becoming more of a much more core element for how identity leaders think about what needs to be done, And I think, yes, we do have full-scale IGA vendors at the bottom, but above we see there's the identity governance centric vendors and also the role that identity governance automation vendors are also going to be playing here. And part of our big conversation today is really talking about the new trends that are helping to redefine this IGA market as it relates to non-human identities, the growth of SaaS applications, as well as disconnected applications. And so our goal is really to speak to what's happening as it relates to what's changing across this entire market ecosystem. And so those are some of what we're going to be talking through. We also wanted to set the context too, for many leaders, who might not be as fully familiar with a lot of your core components of your IGA. I think it's important to remember a huge part of IGA today really has to do with the who, what, and when we talk about identity security. And I think it's very much more distinct from the how that might be enforced from an SSO or an MFA type provider, And I think it's very, very important for our participants to know all of these core elements or these core different attributes that make up your IGA ecosystem. Each of these areas are changing as it relates to some of the trends that I did mention early on, right? The relentless growth of SaaS applications, that includes managed and as well as unmanaged, audit frameworks that are changing either how companies are going about doing auditing now, for example, one of the core attributes of an IGA, entitlements management, and then also even things around access requests and certification as it relates to modern applications today, or how we actually go about doing fulfillment and provisioning. And I think one thing I did want to stress is when we think about the core basics or the core functions of IGA, each of these different elements and processes are evolving, again, all due to this relentless growth in SaaS applications, different identity frameworks that are coming up, and then just the lack of visibility that a lot of leaders still face today. So the next piece we wanted to also just build upon to is we try traditional IGAs on where they do fall short in today's market. I will say you could almost think of it as one of the Achilles heels, quite frankly, for a lot of traditional IGA or identity governance solutions. Primarily has to do with SaaS and application sprawl that has actually happened. I think enterprises now, have an average of over 1,000 applications. However, most IGA vendors, barely have enough connectors to really help them map and connect to a lot of these applications that are being used across the enterprise. And that literally leads us to a situation whereby we have almost about a 30 to 50% coverage gap for quite a few companies, and this actually could vary. Some really large enterprises have a significantly high amount of gaps that they're actually facing. I think another piece that's also adding to a number of these things has to do with the role of non-human identities. With the role that agentic AI will play over the next few years. I mean, we're maybe even months at this point. The rapid progression that we're seeing in terms of agentic AI is making leaders really have to highly think about how they go about implementing identity governance again, but as it relates to a lot of your service accounts, a lot of your bots that increasingly have access to a lot of very, very important sensitive data or sensitive information. And last but not the least is still a lot of the manual task, a lot of the manual processes that are involved in IGA today. Over 80%, of still a big part of provisioning, joiner, and then how employees move and leave, especially offboarding. A lot of these JML events that you need in an IGA governance solution, many things are still done in spreadsheets. There's still a lot of orphaned service accounts, and I think we need to have a conversation on how do we help the industry solve solutions around many of these areas where traditional IGA and identity governance and solutions do help that. I think another thing we do want to maybe create more of a spotlight. In the previous slide we had this section about application sprawl in terms of what's happening within the industry. I think there was a really, really good report by Cerby that I do definitely want to highlight, that I think many leaders will find this very fascinating, a lot of the insights, but I won't go through every part of it, but I'll just share maybe some key highlights from that report. Roughly about 96% of security leaders, still rely on very manual steps, to help them go about provisioning, rotation, and offboarding. A lot of, again, some of those GML events that I just talked about in my previous slide, under 10%, right, still have automation to automate a number of these things. And I think this is one thing we do realize is many of these processes that are still being done on spreadsheets could be automated if you have a good solution. We also want to talk about the disconnected applications. I think a huge part of the gap that we talked about is, roughly about 30% or so of business critical applications, still lack basic identity hygiene, MFA, encryption, and the likes. Additionally to 89% of organizations admit that they still have issues around ex-employees still retaining access, so like a failure as it relates to a lot of your offboarding events. And we have a number of other data points here that do show that currently leaders still have a lot of automation gaps. Many things are still being done manually, and especially as it relates to managing a lot of the disconnected applications, and especially a lot of those shadow applications that you might have within your enterprise.
And Francis, actually, just
Yes.
apologies for interjecting, but one thing I will mention here from the Cerby side of things, that you're not alone, right? If you're looking at this percentage, and one of the takeaways should be just about every enterprise that certainly we've encountered does have this issue, right? And so you're not alone if you're realizing that you have manual workflows. This is a widespread problem, and virtually every company that we've encountered still has, as you mentioned, Francis, a number of manual workflows around the joiner, mover, leaver lifecycle.
Absolutely. No, thank you for doing. Thank you for adding that context. Absolutely. Great. So yeah, I won't speak to this slide, but it just gives a lot of data as it relates to non-human identities, service accounts, and then a lot of the sprawl that we're actually seeing with non-human identities. It's adding a huge element of complexity to the coverage gap many leaders are facing today. So one key finding from our we provided solutions, because I think in identity we have this tendency to speak about problems, challenges. However, many people don't like to talk too much about what are solutions, what are practical, actionable steps that leaders could actually take today right away to actually go about fixing a number of these problems and a lot of these coverage gaps that we do talk about. So we did have a few things that obviously were mentioned, and obviously the different processes, right? The different processes leaders could take depending on the part of your organization where you have the most gap, right? You might be stronger on a particular part of your enterprise, maybe on the provisioning part of it, but maybe the offboarding part is still a big challenge. And so I'll just briefly go through a few of these, and then myself and Bill will maybe just have more of a broader conversation. But again, you could take one of these automation imperatives that we did provide to leaders. So first of all, I will say the first thing, again, the 5 major automation solutions that we did have here for leaders, I will say one of them, the biggest one, is around automating a huge part of your identity lifecycle processes, right? And I think one thing we did really speak to when we did this report, and so far, is the lack of automation. Many things are still done very manually, and one of the core things we really want to recommend, and to any practitioner leader who might be joining us, is linking a lot of your HR events to a lot of your SAMI connectors. And so in most cases, on the provisioning side, this might be around how new hires get access, what are the controls that they do have, what are the core processes that we actually have, and or as it relates to how, when throughout their whole life cycle within the enterprise, what do we actually have good processes around cutting down a lot of the manual provisioning, or throughout their whole life cycle within the enterprise. So a big part of our recommendation here, quite frankly, is linking and connecting a lot of your HR systems, again, to your connectors, back to a lot of your IGA controls that you might have within your enterprise. Again, that was one key thing, and we hope a huge part of this will help solve that. Second piece here is consolidating a lot of your identity data into your major solutions. And so what this could be is you using solutions that have federated integrations with all major IDPs. So you might be using Okta, or might be on an Entra, depending on your IDPs. But we do think a core part of eliminating a number of these a core part of really just helping to reduce a lot of the failed IGA deployments today really just exists because of silos. And so finding vendors and solutions that actually integrate very closely with your IDPs, Azure AD, ServiceNow, depending again, so that the goal here is there's a very, very tight integration across them to cut down on a number of the manual gaps and silos that does exist there. A third one, obviously, another point we did talk about here is just AI-driven continuous certification. And so obviously some leaders here we know have really, really traditional quarterly campaigns, quarterly review campaigns that are very manual and very time sensitive. But could we actually use AI? We've seen this with some vendors who've actually been able to use AI to actually automate and make these processes much easier. I think the big one we're really going to go over here is extending coverage to all applications, and maybe I'll just go through this in my next slide instead. And so I think three major ways in which we think to help extend that coverage is definitely number one here, leveraging RPA to automate a number of key identity workflows. And I'll be happy to talk to Bell to expand more on here. Second piece here, as it relates to extending to all apps, is extending this to a lot of your least privileged controls. So you might have a PAM solution. You want to make sure that it's connected to that. You want to be able to have good audit coverage to a lot of your long tail of applications as it relates to web, SaaS, depending on wherever your users are accessing things from. And last but not the least here has to do with leveraging a solution that's easily able to plug and play into your existing solution. So one challenge we know, and I speak to many leaders, is they don't want to replace. There's always that challenge of trying to replace a lot of your solutions that you have internally. And one advice, my advice to leaders is to find solutions that are able to easily augment or just work side by side with a lot of your IAM, IGA, PAM stacks, and help you do a lot of what we've just talked about around automating a lot of your identity lifecycle management, credential management, or as it relates to privileged access control. But maybe at this point, Bell, I'll maybe happily have you chime in if there's any point here that you really wanted to go deeper on.
No, and thank you so much for going through contents of the report. Again, very spot on based on what we have seen across the industry as well. So always good to see that resonance. There's maybe starting with one of the last points that you mentioned, and would love to maybe elaborate on a little bit. What we typically see is that IGA is a journey, and when Cerby is typically coming into the picture, apologies for that background noise, they've already invested sometimes 7 figures, 8 figures into an identity governance and administration program. And unfortunately, they're usually only 15, 20% of the way through to achieving the coverage that they want to achieve. And so, your last point there, I think is so critical. All of them are certainly, but maybe starting with the last one, because it's important to make what has already been invested in work, right? Because the typical IGA program, again, will be years in the making, and what they have been able to stand up works well for that 20%. But the question is, how do you close the gap for the remaining 80%? And one of the things that Cerby is really focusing on is how do you fundamentally alter the unit economics so that, hey, you're maybe 80% of the way through the budget that you've allocated for IGA, but you're only 20% of the way through from a coverage perspective. How do you make sure that remaining 20% of the budget can actually cover the last 80%? And so that's where our approach around leveraging not just traditional robotic process automation technologies, but layering on, as you represented in the prior slide, artificial intelligence capabilities to make sure that that certification and the actual maintenance of those connectors is always up to date. And so that's a little bit of what we've seen in terms of being able to extend that. I'm curious, Francis, on your end, as you've spoken to folks in the space. Have you heard any of those anecdotes? Does that resonate with what you're also seeing in terms of those percentages of 80% of the way through the budget, only 20% of the way against the intended universe of applications to connect?
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. One thing we hear, I mean, a big part of identity, IGA today is still very services oriented. And so a big part of many leaders, quite frankly, have a lot of service integrators and SIs who are helping them. Maybe I'll just move to my last slide here, but and then we could talk through a number of the points. But one of the big challenges we hear whenever, as it relates to speaking to leaders, is the fact that they still spend and invest a lot of money with the service integrators to actually help them grow and improve and enhance a lot of the IGA solutions. And but you still hear the same problem of issues with connectors to connect to, or maybe HR systems, or a lot of your core ServiceNow systems, or ITSM systems, whatever systems you have internally, and they still have that huge gap as it relates to a lot of the applications. So definitely, and I think now too, what advancements we're seeing in AI, there's a lot of capabilities around helping to at least build connectors rapidly. And I think that's obviously one thing I do like about Cerby's solution, to help to close a lot of these gaps much more fast, quickly. I think another thing to also bring up here is what you guys do as it relates to a lot of the RPA recorders, a lot of your RPA type connectors. I mean, do you maybe want to share more as it relates to that, like in terms of your UI recording? Because I think one thing I really like about what you guys do there is you guys are actually able to, you have a UI recording bot, that's able to mimic, an IT or help desk analyst, and see their entire process, and then is then able to then rotate secrets or push patch keys on a schedule. Do you want to maybe speak more to what you guys do use on the RPA front?
Absolutely. One of there are two dynamics that I think are helpful to call out. One is that another kind of driving factor that you mentioned earlier on in the presentation is that there's just a lot of apps. There's a lot of sprawl, and there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? The moment you start talking about disconnected apps across this SaaS application sprawl environment, a lot of them don't support standards, and so as a consequence, you're seeing different entitlement structures. You're seeing some of them are on-premise, some of them are browser-based, some of them are accessible to the public internet, some of them are not, and so there's just a substantial amount of heterogeneity. And then the second kind of motivating factor here is that oftentimes when you're looking at these applications that have not yet been connected to the incumbent IGA platform, all of the subject matter expertise around how you permission a user, how you provision a user, is in someone's head, right? It's not documented somewhere. It's a handful of people that are hands on keyboard. They're actually doing the work, and so as we encountered that dynamic quite a bit, we realized that we needed to find a way to scalably handle that heterogeneity, but also be able to learn from the subject matter experts, right? For example, we do a lot of work in the healthcare space. We do a lot of work in the financial space. We're yet to find two companies that leverage a banking mainframe the same way, or leverage an electronic health records system the same way. And so what we did is we built something that we call Cerby Scout. And what Cerby Scout does is, as Francis mentioned, is it allows us to learn from the end user and how they use the application. And that directly trains our agent that builds the robotic process automation routines. And so, again, when you look at this problem, there's a lot of sprawl, there's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of information that only exists in the heads of the subject matter experts. We've had a lot of success bringing those subject matter experts into the robotic process automation training process to actually directly train what we're doing. And so this is one of the things that allows us to create those connectors much faster, and more or less on first go, have them properly mimic and in some cases enhance what the human operators were doing already. And so, yeah, Francis, you're exactly right. I'm curious, as you've seen and again had have conversations with folks, do you see any of that dynamic where the subject matter experts have all the knowledge in their head and it doesn't really exist across the rest of the organization?
Oh, I mean, definitely. I think definitely that's definitely a big challenge, and I do think that was really one thing when we're doing our research, because again, we've spoken and we've done a lot of work across the industry in terms of the different solutions we've seen, but that's one thing we definitely really liked about that. To your point, yes, or even if you do have a lot of employees who might have who might have this knowledge, they don't want to have to repeat doing this task over and over. And like especially rotating secrets are very manual and cumbersome job for many teams, or pushing passkeys at a specific schedule. If you could literally just have a bot that you could just run and automate that, like absolutely. And so you do have a situation whereby it's also allowing those analysts or IT admins to focus on much more important things, as opposed to and then also to your point, I think beyond even just the basic, it helps augment and better complement a lot of what they do. So I think that's definitely a big one. How about what are the solutions, for other leaders who might be watching this too? In terms of, we talked about some of the work you guys are doing on connectors, but what are other solutions, that you are seeing on the field, or it could be even very successful case studies of, again, companies that have a lot of these coverage gaps, and how they could actually go about reducing those and closing those gaps that maybe that Cerby has that you've seen on the market too.
Yeah, one of the dynamics that I think is worth calling out is, sometimes when we start working with the identity teams and we mention our solution, the conversation tends to really be focused on legacy on-premise applications. I would say that's where a lot of the time the mind goes to. It's like, well, like I really only have this with that domain of applications. But one of the things that we've started to see as we work with even companies that I would say are more digitally native, meaning that they tend to be companies that were built sometime in the last 10 years, is they also have this provisioning, permissioning, deprovisioning problem with SaaS-based applications. And one of the things that we do internally is every year to year and a half, we work with folks like yourselves to create a list of the top 10,000 applications used across the enterprise. And then we exhaustively go identify how many of them support SCIM, how many of them support APIs to be able to carry out these flows programmatically. And one of the things that we saw that you saw on a slide a few slides ago is that 93% of the top 10,000 applications do not support a programmatic way to be able to handle this join, remove, or leave flows. And a good majority of them are SaaS applications. And so it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think the key takeaway there is this is not just a problem with legacy applications, whether they're on-premise or what have you. It's something that actually spans all genre of applications. And so we've been able to help our customers with all manner of applications, again, whether they're browser-based, SaaS-based, on-premise, banking mainframe, green screen terminals, mobile-based. We do a fair amount of work in the Asia Pacific region. And so that's what's necessary if you really want to be able to close that coverage gap. You need to work everywhere that your application owners are working. And guess what? It's not always a very clean browser-based experience. Sometimes it's a point of sale system, for example. And so that's one of the key things that we've developed to be able to meet the customer and the application owner wherever they might be. And maybe kind of posing that question back to you in a form. I'm curious, as you've met with well-established companies, digitally native companies, what do you see in terms of what the mix is of on-premise applications, SaaS-based applications? Do you see customers kind of having that aha moment of, hey, I actually have this problem across all my application sprawl, not just a particular version of it or type of it?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, both the on-prem and the SaaS piece are definitely element. I think definitely you do have a lot of it could be sometimes on-prem, sometimes a lot of your SaaS. But I think what's more fascinating to your point too is just how I think a lot of people think, yes, applications that were built like last 10 years or thereabout, much more modern applications. I think a lot of people underestimate how much there's still a coverage gap for those ones. And I think and the whole reason for this being when we think about the infrastructure stack for a lot of your traditional IGA or identity governance solutions, they were just never really built to interconnect very well, or talk really well with a lot of your modern SaaS applications. And so you still have a situation whereby companies that we need to make that connection together. So it's definitely one that we do hear about. I do definitely usually a lot of unmanaged applications. In so many cases, companies don't even know of applications that their employees are using within the enterprise. And so I think there's still that visibility component of, we don't even know the unknown, right? It's almost like the unknown, and you need to have this ability to be able to feed data, from SSPM tools or CASB logs or whatever, to just be able to help you identify a lot of unmanaged applications beyond just what we already know exists with your normal SaaS-based Workday, HR, or SAP system. So it's definitely one I do completely resonate with what you're saying as well. And then I think the last piece here as well is also just around how we actually go about enhancing. Just something I hear around is rotating passwords or API tokens on schedule, even for some that you already see. I think that's another thing too. Or, or how do you enforce MFA, for those existing. So sometimes, yes, you might already have the applications within your controls, but how do you actually enforce a lot of these join mover lever processes? And I think that's where you find a lot of the cumbersome processes. And I do think there's also a reason why we also need this identity orchestration layer for a lot of your much more modern based applications. So it is absolutely something that I do resonate with you as well, but on both sides. One question I had for you, maybe if you wanted to help the audience, I see this in the audience, is how many applications would you guys say today are currently like within Service Integration Network? And obviously, how fast could you guys support new ones? Because I think another problem enterprises do find is, okay, now you've helped me discover my existing applications. You've been able to help me to enforce a lot of these GML controls or provisioning, but how fast could you actually support new ones? If they're going through a digital transformation, they're rapidly bringing in. There's this need for continuous discovery. So maybe if you wanted to just share more on that.
Absolutely. We've today we have a little bit over 2,100 out-of-the-box integrations that span everything from what you mentioned, password rotation, enabling federated login for non-SSO supporting apps, to connectors that focus on joiner mover lever flows. So we have a very large ecosystem of out-of-the-box applications. And as we work with partners like Savient, for example, we're able to help really make the existing platform just connect to a much broader ecosystem of applications. Now, at the same time, one of the other things that we've realized is, you've mentioned discovery as a concept quite a bit, and I think it's so critical within this domain. Across our top 50 customers, we've discovered 17,000 disconnected applications. And so it's a very large ecosystem of potential applications that are yet to be connected. And so, when we started looking at those numbers, one of the things we realized is it's not enough to just have a large library of connectors. You also need to be very fast at creating them. And so one of the things that we're very good at doing is we can turn around new integrations quite quickly. For on-premise connections, that can take up to 10 business days, but for browser-based, we're typically looking at a 2, sometimes 5 business day turnaround. And so we've made it very easy to basically have this workflow now where within 3 weeks, when you discover the application, we can have that connected. And based on what we've seen, that is a land speed record. That is much faster from what you might see in a more typical circumstance. And so we have a great library of connectors, but I think more importantly, we're also very fast at creating them. And one of the things we're working on is actually opening up that ecosystem so that our customers can actually create the connectors themselves. Now, maybe one question on the back of that was also posed by the audience is, how does Cerby deal with the joiner mover lever flow with orphan accounts? And so how the Cerby system operates in that case is that There are two ways. One, we can be given a service account on the application in question, and then that service account will basically crawl the application to identify all of the users inside of that application, and then we'll link back every user record found in that application back to the upstream source of identity truth, whether that's an IDP or an IGA platform. And so once we've discovered the individual users and linked the user records to the upstream identity source of truth, if any action occurs in the IGA platform, we're then able to propagate that action downstream to the previously disconnected application. Now, one of the really nice things about this automatic audit, and this was one of the concepts and imperatives that you mentioned 3 slides ago, Francis, is that you then start to be able to automate a lot of these manual audit and compliance reviews. If you can automatically crawl the members listing in the application, and then automatically reconcile who's in the downstream application with who's in the IGA platform, you start to discover orphaned accounts. You start to discover maybe users that are over permissioned. And because we can also help with single sign-on, you also start to discover users who are permissioned but haven't used the application in quite some time. And so a lot of that really starts with that discovery piece initially. One question back to you, Francis. One of the things that we've seen is there's also sometimes inertia around IGA programs, meaning that users kind of just get used to running manual workflows and they don't realize how manual it is and how much time is spent. Are there any strategies that you've seen could be effective for customers in terms of or IGA folks running IGA programs in terms of really understanding just how much manual work is going into supporting the status quo?
Yes, for sure. I would say it obviously depends. It really does depend, but definitely, I mean, it's still it's one of, I hate to say, but sometimes it's one of the, like, it's IGA, whenever you mention this to a security leader or a CISO, they're just like, oh, they just have this huge agitation because it's because of the manual process. It's just a huge amount of complexity. And as we all know, like a lot of the firms at least that I speak to, these are usually the largest companies, usually Fortune 500 type companies that have these big IGA programs and services. But I will say for sure, I mean, and that was what propelled this report was, a big piece of it being around how do we automate as much solutions. I think that's at least one goal in which we could actually help to reduce a number of the complexities that are being associated. But yeah, I think the very big one in terms of solutions that I think has worked for leaders now is how do we use AI now to build rapid connectors? Because again, the visibility and the discovery and the coverage gap, that one just isn't going anywhere in terms of all of your different systems, Workday, ServiceNow, your HR systems, your IGA, and a lot of your SaaS applications. How do you actually have there's this integrated workflow across each of them? And I think it still continues to be one of the biggest complexities. But you know what? How do we now use a lot of modern technologies to help build connectors fast? And I do to continue to cover a lot of these gaps. And I do think that was one emphasis we still continue to give to leaders. And obviously, I think we really like what you guys are doing there in terms of what you guys are building in terms of building this or recorded base or different types of connectors to improve that. That's definitely one. I think number two obviously has to relate to again, we have to use the word AI, but again, we have the ability of AI to actually help us in terms of risk-based access controls or AI-assisted certifications and other solutions that we do give. And so a lot of this might be around using AI to, now you could actually build AI models that actually help you with role mining, that could help you around continuous attestations, especially this is more around like, how do we how do we actually satisfy auditors' demand in terms of how we're actually providing new reports. So those were modern technologies, if you wanted to call them. as to helping companies solve for these old traditional problems. But again, and most sometimes too, a lot of these also comes down to processes internally. You know, what are the types of processes you have in place? Because sometimes technology might not always be it might not always be, a lot of the time you might have broken processes internally as it relates to how maybe your HR systems, your SMI systems, SMIM systems are talking. So those are just some things, at least right now, we're giving to. We advise, and obviously NHI and non-human identity has its own risk and discoverability challenges and governance controls around that. But have you seen any other successful, it could be maybe financial institutions, maybe give us an example, Bell, within maybe the financial service, because this is a very prominent problem we know in the industry. It'd be great if you had maybe some examples of it could be the kinds of applications you guys support with them, but also more importantly, how do you guys, what advices or even successful case studies do you have of how they've been able to overcome these challenges and gaps?
Absolutely. We have a number of customers in the financial services, fintech space. And, you know, as an aside, one of the interesting things about the financial space is, you know, it tends to be a more highly regulated space. And so you have frameworks like Sarbanes-Oxley that actually place a, not restriction, but very strong guidelines on how you manage access to applications that are within scope of SOX. And so, you know, what we end up seeing is with our credit union customers, regional banks, major banks, you know, private equity type customers, there are two types of applications that are usually driving most of the friction. One is the banking mainframes, right? Mainframes still exist, whether you want them to or not. I frequently hear our investors say, you know, they were talking about mainframes dying in the 80s, and they had a banner sales year in the late 2010s, and so mainframes are here, and they will be sticking around. And so we see a lot around helping automate the join, remove, reliever flow for your banking mainframes, which again take you know, manifest in a variety of different forms. The other application family that we see a lot within the financial space are all of the reporting portals, right? When you're in a highly regulated space, you need to typically report things back up to the government, and you know, this is not taking a shot at the government portals, but they don't support single sign-on, and it's often shared identities. And if they are individual identities that users are using to access, the provisioning process sometimes requires picking up the phone and calling to get someone added or sending an email. And so these are the types of applications that are, you know, that latter case are thrust on top of the financial services players, and they kind of have to meet the application where the application is. And so those are some of the common app families that we found, and we've been able to come in and completely 100% automate those workflows that, again, in some cases are involving things like picking up the phone and calling the application owner to actually add a user on their end. So that's a little bit of what we've seen. We have another question here coming in from an audience member, just reading it here. With Cerby building its inventory of connectors, do you see yourself getting into the ISPM space? It sounds like you already offer some of these insights. You know, let me maybe answer that from the Cerby perspective, and then Francis would love to kind of hear your more kind of general perspective there. You know, we see ourselves as focusing on that last mile of identity. There are already very strong incumbents who've built remarkable and very robust policy engines, whether it's in the ISPM space or other adjacent spaces, SSPM, Francis, you mentioned, you know, SaaS security posture management. And so our goal is to partner. Our goal is to go get that unstructured, previously inaccessible data and make it available to the systems that our customers have already invested in. Because again, you know, we don't necessarily see the problem as being the incumbents. It's the fact that there's just a lot of heterogeneity. There's a lot of applications for all. And so we want to be able to activate that data and put it in a format that is consumable by the systems that our customers have already have already purchased. And so sometimes that may mean that we are generating the insights and then handing it off to the ISPMs. But we believe that that's a dynamic that works best within existing budgets, existing technology investments, because again, we talked a lot about IGA. To some extent, it's also true in the ISPM space. These are large program budgets, and there's certainly the sunk cost fallacy. But if you can make what's already been stood up work better and give it more coverage, we find that that's usually a better winning strategy. I'm curious, Francis, what you've seen more generally in this space.
Oh man, I mean, ISPM is a big topic, and for people who might not be aware, but identity security posture management. I think we actually did a report earlier this year. We did a report around identity attack surface management, but one of the biggest pieces of that was we spoke to what's happening as it relates to ISPM. And obviously, ISPM is definitely one of the biggest conversational point I would definitely say I've maybe had with security leaders. Again, it all comes to this visibility gap, but obviously Cerby helps to do this, especially as it relates to applications, on-prem SaaS applications. But more broadly, I think when we think about a traditional identity stack for most leaders, your access management, authentication controls, your IGA and your PAM, and maybe ITDR, across your broad spectrum of identity solutions, there is still a gap as it relates to seeing all the different identities that does exist, and then having some common layer that actually integrates everything together. And I think that's what's led to this category of ISPM, and it's actually a fairly new area. So it's a big conversation point because there's just so many loopholes around discoverability and visibility as it relates not only just human, but I think non-human identities is actually significantly make this much more complex. So number one, ISPM, it's a big theme, it's a big conversation we hear and continues to still be one. But obviously, as it relates to the likes of what Cerby, I mean, it definitely is something for you guys to definitely think about. But I think Cerby does a really good job as it relates to doing a lot of that same discoverability as it relates to all of your shadow application that else exists at different parts. And I do think that one is definitely still a big one because a lot of the time you can't secure, protect, or enforce permissions or even understand excessive permissions if you don't know what's happening with those specific applications. And so definitely see that. But more broadly, yes, I think increasingly ISPM is a big conversation. And we recommend that for every leader today to have some type of discovering engine that feeds into your modern IGA program that gives you clean data across everything.
But with that, I believe that was the last question. Francis, I want to thank you again so much for taking the time out of your, I know, super busy schedule to speak with us and share all of these wonderful insights. I also want to give thanks and appreciation to the very large audience that joined us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either me, Bell at Cerby.com, BEL at Cerby.com, or Francis. Francis, I'll let you share your contact details as well. But wanted to thank everybody so much for the time, and Francis, especially thank you as well for the time.
No, thank you very much, Bell, for having me. Thank you to Cerby for hosting this. I think it's a big conversation. I think a lot of companies and enterprises struggle with a number of these. And I think you mentioned this, Bell, early on. You don't have to feel alone if you feel like some of this gap exists with you. And I think the goal here is to help share different solutions that are working and provide a framework for leaders. And please feel free to reach out to any of us. I'm at the Software Analyst Cyber Research at substack.com, and you could find me easily there. And then maybe one last thing I'll just share is a number of resources that we have as it relates to any of this topic. So obviously I did a report around from complexity to control, using automation to transform enterprise identity security. It goes through a lot of these concepts. And then I also had identity attack surface management that covered a lot of these discoverability challenges with ISPM, and this is a way you could find me for more information. But thank you very much, everyone, and it's a pleasure doing this.
Excellent. Thanks again. Thanks all.